While today to us it might have looked inevitable that war would have broken out in 1914, most people at the time would laugh at you for just suggesting the idea. And they wouldn't be totally wrong. The events that led to World War I were completely unpredictable and just so happened to occur at right time to push Europe to war. In 1914, no one could have predicted that a 19-year-old kid would kill the Austrian prince, or that Japan would defeat Russia in 1905. Or even how much advances in technology would change war. But let's take a step back and see what these events that led up to the war actually were. The first and probably most important one was the alliance system. The most important one of these alliances was the Entente Cordiale between England and France. They both saw Kaiser Wilhelm thirsting over expanding Germany's influence, and so they put aside their old beef and joined forces to stop him. They also later added Russia transforming into the Triple Entente and surrounding Germany on all sides. But Germany didn't just sit still during all of this and made their own alliances with Austria and Italy, creating the Triple Alliance, setting the stage for some drama down the road. The second cause were a bunch of little wars before the big World War. The Italian-Turkish War and the Russian-Japanese War both exposed how weak Russia and the Ottomans really were, and Germany's support for the South Africans against the British in the Boer War just made them hate each other even more. The hundreds of little colonial wars made the Europeans compete for influence around the world, and losses of land from previous wars gave them an axe to grind with each other. But all of this was just fuel for the fire, and it still needed a spark, and that spark came in July 1914 in the form of a depressed alcoholic, Teenager, and a couple of his suicidal buddies. Gavrilo Princip was born in 1894 to a poor family of Serbian farmers. He spent most of his childhood on his family farm tending to their sheep herds, but was sent off at 13 to Sarajevo to study at a merchant school. While he did do well in school, he became extremely depressed after failing finals, and in an effort to lift his spirits he turned to the time-honored Eastern European tradition of extreme alcoholism, reportedly downing 3 bottles of vodka a day at his peak. Princip was looking for purpose in his life, and he found that purpose in violent nationalism. He joined the Black Hand, a secret society that wanted an independent Bosnia, and participated in multiple protests. He eventually got expelled from school after threatening rival students with brass knuckles, which caused him to start drinking even more, and when he tried to sign up for the army, he was reportedly rejected. On the spot for looking too weak. I mean, at this point you really got a feel for the guy, well, as much as you can feel for an alcoholic mafia enforcer, but still, he failed his exams, got expelled, and got humiliated in front of hundreds of people when he tried to serve his country. All of this made him determined to do something big, something brave, something to prove to everyone that he wasn't just a failure. And what would you know, that opportunity came driving into town on June 28th. The Archduke of Austria and heir to the imperial throne, Franz Ferdinand. Seeing this chance, Princip got a couple of his Black Hand buddies together and hatched a plot. They would throw grenades at the Archduke's car from the crowd as his motorcade was traveling through the city, and finish the job with pistols that they hid under their jackets. When the day came, 5 of his co-conspirators hid in the crowd with their bombs. As the cars passed them, the first 2 assassins got cold feet and ran away. The third assassin, Abrinovi, threw his grenade but failed to not only kill the Archduke but himself as well, since the bomb got deflected by a bodyguard, and when he tried to die by swallowing a poison pill and jumping into the river, he threw up from the cheap poison and fell face first in the canal, where he got dragged out and beaten by the crowd. Further along the route, Princip and the remaining assassins were unable to get within range of the car and had to call off their plan. Wow, you think? That's great, no one was killed, the assassination failed. Peace in our time, right? Right? No. After a short stay at a hotel, the Archduke went to visit the injured at the hospital when his driver made a wrong turn and drove right down the street where Princip was eating a sandwich after calling off the plan. He probably couldn't believe his luck, but he wasted no time, jumped up, and shot the Archduke square in the chest before being immediately knocked out by a sword from the prince's guards, but by that point it was too late, and the spark was lit. Now, while murder plots are exciting, we need to understand the situation all of these nations were in that caused that little assassination to turn into war, and for that, we need to do some math. There's going to be a lot of numbers ahead, but just stay with us. Since World War I was the first industrial total war, it's important to understand the condition of each side going into the war and how that affected their strategy. And to do that, we're going to use three main measurements. GDP can tell us the relative strength of the economy. The higher the GDP, the more developed the nation. Territory shows us how much land a country controls, which can tell us the amount of resources that it has at its disposal, as well as how much land it can give up before it's forced to surrender. And population tells us how many people the nation can mobilize for the war. More people means more soldiers for the front, and more workers in the factories, allowing for a larger war effort. Just a small note. 100-year-old statistics are weird, so all of the numbers here are inflation adjusted to 2023 US dollars. In 1914, the economy of Great Britain was valued at $450 billion. It controlled an area of around 121,000 square miles, and had a population of 42 million people. Now, when compared to Germany's $480 billion GDP, 158,000 square miles, population of 67 million, and Austria's GDP of $380 billion, territory of 216,000 square miles, and population of 52 million people, Britain might look a little out of its league. But we still have to factor in its French allies' GDP of 400 billion, territory of 21,300 square miles, and population of 40 million. Now, this looks like a fair fight if slightly in the Central Powers' favor, but we have to add in the most important factor, the Empire. When factored in, the British dominions of Canada, India, Australia, South Africa and Egypt had a combined GDP of $1.1 trillion, a total land area of 14 million square miles, and a population of 88 million people, bringing the Allies far ahead of Germany and Austria. Okay, now we get that was a lot of numbers that we just threw in your face, but what they basically tell us is that the Allies' power came mostly from the colonies, and they would need to rely on their resources to win any war. The British and French empires, while immensely powerful, were unwieldy and unorganized, made up of dozens of autonomous dominions. While if given preparation, the colonies of British India, Canada and Australia, along with French Algeria and Vietnam, could raise millions of men for the war, recruiting, training, and sending them to Europe could take months, time which they may not have. Because of this, Allied strategy relied heavily on defense. The French army just needed to hold out for a couple months until reinforcements could arrive and push back the Germans. The Central Powers, on the other hand, knew that they had the advantage so long as the empires were excluded, which gave them a just couple months to strike a decisive blow and knock the Allies out of the war before they could mobilize their overseas territories and overwhelm Germany with sheer numbers. This thinking is what created the Schlieffen Plan. With the Royal Navy having total dominance in the North Sea, an invasion of Britain was seen as impossible, but France and its land border with Germany was seen as an easier target. The Germans planned to use their larger and better-trained army to quickly run through Belgium and defeat the main French army before they could call for reinforcements. The German war strategy planned to use their initial advantage in size and stockpiled material to expand as quickly as possible, in order to bring in the resources, population, and industry that they would need to even have a chance at fighting a much larger and longer war with Britain and Russia. But there was one wild card that could throw a wrench in all of this: the United States. From 1914 all the way until the end of the war, 1918, the US had a larger GDP, territory, and population than any other country on Earth, and if it joined either side it would have guaranteed victory. But the US was an ocean away from the conflict, and the isolationism movement argued that the war was a European conflict and that America should stay neutral. While the public heavily favored the Allies, it would still take a big event to convince the US to join. All right, now that all of the numbers are out of the way, let's get to the exciting part, the actual war. Austria gave Serbia 28 days to accept their demands, and when they refused, Austria and Germany declared war. This spiraled into a world war when France, Russia, and Britain joined Serbia. Within a month, 10 million men were mobilized across Europe and sent to the front thinking they would be home by Christmas. Following the Schlieffen Plan on August 7th, Marshal von Moltke ordered the German North Army to start its attack. First Corps under General Wilhelm von Kluck was able to run through the Allied defensive lines in North Belgium and cross the French border with help from Crown Prince Wilhelm's Fifth Army at the Battle of the Frontiers. They were followed by Prince Ludwig's Bavarian Sixth Army, and combined with the southern spearhead of Max von Hausen's Third Corps. They annihilated the combined Allied force at the Battle of Charleroi, putting the British Army into a full retreat, allowing the Germans to take control of northern France and advance to just 30 miles away from Paris. Von Moltke ordered the army to stop and wait for more reinforcements to arrive before attacking Paris, but unwilling to stop so close to his goal and hoping to steal the glory for capturing Paris. General von Kluck disobeyed orders and advanced without support from the main army. This caused a gap to open up in the German line, which was quickly seized on by French Marshal Joffre, who successfully defeated and almost encircled the Cinque Corps at the Marne, only being saved by a last-minute counterattack from Ludwig's Bavarians. But the damage was already done, and the Germans were forced to retreat back to the Reims River and give up the idea of a quick war. This would end the Schlieffen Plan, with the Germans failing to capture Paris. Both sides were tired and lacking any ability to launch new offensives, and so they settled into their defensive lines for the winter, marking the start of trench warfare. Conditions in the trenches were often horrible, with poor sanitation allowing disease to spread and cause millions of deaths. There was no escape from the threat of death, with snipers picking off anyone who stood or peeked their head over the top. While the Western Front was beginning to stall, the Eastern Front was anything but. When war broke out, the Stavka, the Russian High Command, ordered the invasion of East Prussia in hopes of quickly defeating the Germans. 4 armies under Grand Duke Nikolaevich crossed the Pregolia River and quickly overwhelmed the Max von Prittwitz German 8th Corps that was defending the area, managing to advance to Kaliningrad. This let the Cossacks of 2nd and 4th Corps under General Samsonov to emerge from the main Russian army and make a run for the Vistula River, cutting off destroying the German rear guard at Gumbin. But the lightning-quick Russian advance outran their own supply lines, and a lack of food forced them to slow down and settle in for a slow siege outside Königsberg. When news of this defeat reached Berlin, it sent the General Staff panicking. Thinking that the attack was just a prelude to a larger Russian offensive, von Moltke dispatched 50,000 men to East Prussia under the command of the legendary Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. A war hero of the French and Austrian wars, Hindenburg was one of the greatest generals in Germany, but had been retired since 1911. It was only after a personal request from the Emperor himself that Hindenburg took control of the 8th Army, alongside his Lieutenant Erich Ludendorff. Taking command in August, he quickly set out reorganizing the German defense and reinforcing supply lines for an offensive to drive out the Russians. Finally, after 3 weeks of preparation, at midnight on the 23rd, the German artillery opened up on the Russian army at Tannenberg Forest, disorienting them, opening up gaps in the line, letting German divisions infiltrate and destroy the defenses before the main army launched an offensive the next day, routing the Russians. In a total reversal of the first weeks of the war, 2 columns of cavalry under German General von Rennkampf rode forward past the main army. attacking weak points on the Russian flanks before being able to finally break through near the Mauritian lakes and pursue the Russians over 100 kilometers before stopping to rest. With the rest of the army following close behind them, the 8th Army marched into Poland, winning another victory at Lodz, and by mid-1915 the Russian army was in full retreat with Hindenburg right behind them. But the Germans were not the only problem the Russians had to deal with, because to the south, the Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, and they were making gains way faster than the Russians expected. On November 14th, Sultan Mehmed V issued an order declaring jihad or holy war on the Allied powers. The declaration of war blindsided even the highest-ranked Ottoman officials. While the Ottoman Empire did have close ties to Germany, they had expressed clear intention of not joining the war, and had even declared neutrality earlier that year. Its new allies, Germany and Austria, were surprised as well. Although they had been encouraging the Ottomans to enter the conflict, even they didn't expect it to happen so soon. Nonetheless, the order went through, and the Ottoman army began offensive operations in the Caucasus later that month. Of special note are R&D Corps' 9th and 11th Guards, who were dispatched to the Caucasus under the command of current Lieutenant General and future war criminal Enver Pasha, which should be enough to tell you the direction all this about to go. When they arrived, Pasha took over command of the army and override the previous defensive order, instead ordering an all-out attack on the Russian line. One thing led to another, and Pasha's entire army was annihilated by the Russians, and the following retreat resulted in the deaths of thousands of Turkish soldiers, making it the Empire's worst defeat of the war. After the battle, Pasha blamed the loss on Armenians in the army, even though the only reason even he survived the battle was because an Armenian soldier dug him out of the mud and carried him for 8 miles back to camp. Keep this in mind, it'll become important later. With his army thoroughly squashed and humiliated, Pasha was recalled back to Istanbul and replaced by the much more competent Brigadier Hakim Hafi and his German advisors. Together they were able to stabilize the disaster that Pasha left behind, but the damage was done, with the Third Army lacking the men and supplies to launch any future operations. While all this was happening in the Caucasus, in the south the Ottoman army was attempting to push the British out of the Middle East, but with the train wreck that happened up north, you can probably tell how his is going to go. When war was declared, General Ahmed Dimal was ordered to attack Egypt, but hit tougher than expected resistance at the Suez Canal. Out of his entire army, only the 38th and 72nd companies of 400 men were able to cross the canal before being driven back by a division of Indian cavalry. The rest of the army didn't do much better, and a counterattack from the Mysore and Bengal Mounted Corps forced the Dimal to retreat back to the Sinai. At the same time, the Indian army had landed in Iraq and were running circles around the Ottomans with Maratha cavalry of 117 Division, capturing the city of Basra with barely any resistance in mid-November. But mainland Europe and the Middle East weren't the only areas that was in chaos from the war. On the seas, from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, German submarines wreaked havoc on Allied transports and warships. For the 100 years from 1814 to 1914, the Royal Navy was the largest naval force in history. Its hundreds to thousands of warships ensured British dominance of the oceans, from the coast of Canada to the smallest islands in the Pacific, guarding trade and ensuring stability in the empire. The Home Fleet under Admiral James Beatty was the most powerful in the world, with over 40 main battleships and hundreds of other smaller support ships. The French Navy, while almost completely destroyed at Trafalgar in 1805, had rebuilt itself and was now one of the most powerful on Earth. Especially in the Mediterranean, the Southern Fleet under Admiral Leper could easily cut off the connection between Germany and the colonies, starving the Central Powers of raw materials. But compared to its allies, the Russian Navy was by far the weakest of the three. After being smashed by the Japanese at Tsushima, the Pacific Fleet and half the Baltic Fleet were basically gone, and the Black Sea Fleet, which was the only one that still had most of its ships in one piece, was stuck in the Black Sea, not able to enter the Mediterranean due to the Ottomans blocking the way. On top of this, Admiral Rozhesvensky, the commander of the Baltic Fleet and probably the last competent Russian admiral, had died in 1909 and was replaced by the much less competent Nikolai Essen. On the other hand, there was Germany. Since unification in 1878, the new German Empire had built up its navy into the second largest in the world, second only to the British. Admiral Franz Hipper's High Seas Fleet was able to go toe-to-toe with Beatty's home fleet, and the invention of the submarine by the Germans posed a serious threat to Allied trade. In the Mediterranean, the relatively small Austrian Kriegsmarine wasn't much of a threat. But if Italy joined the war alongside Germany, the large Regina Marina could cut off British access to India through Egypt and starve the empire of resources and reinforcements, and as a result the Allies worked to ensure Italy stayed neutral. With the outbreak of war, the High Seas Fleet skirmished with the home fleet in the North Sea, with the hope of winning a quick victory, but a British ambush at Heligoland and again at Dogger Bank forced the Germans to retreat and let the British start a blockade of Germany. At the same time, Admiral Leiper's Southern Squadron was able to launch multiple hit-and-run attacks on the Austrian fleet, and with the entry of Italy on the side of the Allies the next year, the Austrian navy was surrounded and destroyed by late 1915. In the Black Sea, while the Russian navy was able to defeat the Ottomans, they were still blocked in, since the Ottomans still controlled the only entrance or exit. With the Austrian and Ottoman navies crippled and the Germans stuck in port, by the end of 1915, the Allies had achieved total control of the seas. But the Allies weren't okay with just sitting sound and waiting for the war to end, and instead they planned to use their advantage to open a second front against the Central Powers. With the war in the Middle East turning into a stalemate, the Allies were looking for a way to quickly knock the Ottomans out of the war, and the idea that they came up with was an attack on Istanbul. Admiral Winston Churchill proposed a plan to land at Gallipoli and cut off the capital from the rest of the empire and divert Ottoman troops, allowing the Russians launch an attack in the north. The plan was accepted, and the Australian ANZSC and Indian TH Brigade were assigned to capture the area. Naval and air attacks started in February, aiming to destroy Ottoman inland artillery and defences, but weren't effective due to the Turks moving their guns away from the area. The landings had to be delayed due to bad weather, but the weather cleared and the order to attack was sent on April 25, 2024. At 4 a.m., Gurkha and Marines of TH Company stormed the South Beach while the 1st and 2nd New Zealand regiments attacked North Beach. The British were overconfident and thought this would be a quick and easy operation, but their intel was wrong, and they underestimated the Ottoman troops. Because the Ottoman army at Gallipoli wasn't the same one that they had been fighting in the Middle East. This was the 5th Guards Army, the Empire's best of the best, and commanding them was the legendary Major Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the greatest generals in Turkish history. Knowing that reinforcements were days away, Kemal ordered his men to hold the beaches no matter the cost, telling his men, "I order you to fight, to die. In the time elapsed that we die, more will arrive to take our place." None of the 3,000 men of 57th Division holding the beaches survived, but their sacrifice delayed the Allies enough so that reinforcements could arrive. The entire way up the Gallipoli cliffs, Ottomans, following the orders of Kemal, threw themselves at the British until they ran out of ammunition, then fixed bayonets and charged the Allied lines. The battle turned into a bloody stalemate, with the Allies not able to advance against so much resistance, and with both sides running out of supplies. The Entente tried to launch one last attack to break the Ottomans. While they were able to take the high ground at the cliffs, a division led by Kemal charged up the hill and broke through the defensive lines, forcing them to fall back. The fighting would rage on for 5 more months, with Ataturk on the front lines leading his men. Eventually the reinforcements he was promised arrived, and with new men and supplies, the Turks launched a final attack to drive the Allies back into the sea. Ottoman attacks during night took the Allies by surprise, and the darkness made their machine guns almost useless. The almost suicidal determination of the Turks terrified the British. In multiple attacks, Ottoman raiders jumped into Anzac trenches and cut down the Australian troops with knives so they wouldn't make any noise. At least 3 times Turkish officers led their men into French machine guns with nothing but swords, and Ottoman stormtroopers happily ran into British trenches with grenades strapped to their chests. Unable to keep supporting the campaign, and with mounting casualties, the Allied command decided to retreat. The entire operation was a humiliation for the Allies, forcing Churchill to resign from the government, and showed that the Ottomans weren't the pushovers that everyone thought they were. Mustafa Kemal would become a national hero from the battle, earning the Medal of Bravery as well as a promotion to general, eventually leading the 4th Army in Arabia, and would later go on to become first President of Turkey. Back in Europe, the war was turning into a stalemate. In the West, the Schlieffen Plan failed at capturing Paris, and both sides were forced to dig in for the winter. In the East the Russian offensive had been stopped by the Germans at Tannenberg, and the 8th Army was marching into Poland. The Germans knew that they couldn't win a long war, so they needed a way to end the war quickly before the Allies could regroup and push them back. Von Moltke's failure in 1916 had caused him to be sacked and replaced by Marshal Erich von Falkenhayn, who created a new strategy of bloody surrender. He planned to attack the French at a place they couldn't retreat from, and then bleed the French army until they ran out of men. The location he picked for this attack was at Verdun, on the banks of the Meuse River. The city was a national monument, and its loss would have destroyed French morale, so the order was given to hold the town no matter the cost. The bombardment began in February, and the German army overran Fort Douaumont in the first days of the battle and continued to advance towards the town. German artillery brought from the Eastern Front destroyed any resistance in front of them. A French counterattack was able to recapture the fort before being surrounded and destroyed. But the French weren't completely helpless. Taking over command of the French army was General Philippe Pétain. In the first days of the attack, he commanded the defense, which eventually stopped the Germans and organized 20 divisions to be sent as reinforcements. Declaring that the Germans would not pass another inch of French land, he led multiple offensives to break the German lines. Under his leadership, the French would recapture both Vaux and Douaumont forts before launching another attack capturing Fort Souville. The town of Fleury was stormed by French commandos in June before being lost and recaptured 16 times over the next 2 months. To the north, the Battle of the Somme started later that year, and both sides had to divert troops to cover their flanks. The British offensive there failed, but it provided the time for the French to launch an attack to break the German lines. This, along with fresh American troops entering Europe after the United States joined the war, was the final nail in the coffin. The German plan to win the war had failed, and from this point Germany would be on the defensive in the west, just trying to hold the line until reinforcements arrived. The victory at Verdun would make Pétain a national hero, earning him the Medal of Honor and a promotion to Marshal of France, eventually commanding the 8th Army through Germany by 1918. But while the Western Front was turning in the Allies' favor in the east, Russia was collapsing, and the arrival of a certain mustached revolutionary was about to send the nation into civil war. By the end of 1916, the Russian Empire was collapsing. The loss of Ukraine and Poland to the German army in the east had put the army on the defensive, slowly running out of men and supplies. In St. Petersburg, the mad monk Rasputin inspired rumors about the royal family, and in the streets the people were starving. A normal person would see this and be absolutely horrified, but one man saw this and decided, "This is the place for me." Vladimir Ilyich Lenin had been banished from Russia a decade ago for trying to start a communist revolution. Some people might have given up after losing all of their property, family, and citizenship, But Lenin just decided that his plans just needed to wait a bit. And wouldn't you know it, he was right. In an effort to further destabilize the Russian government, the Germans gave Lenin a first-class train ticket to Moscow, telling him to go wild. And go wild he did. He used fear of the Germans, starvation, and plain old violence to capitalize the ongoing February Revolution and out himself in charge of the new provisional government. After a couple months later of killing political opponents, bullying others to resign, and at least 2 attempted coups, his allies decided they had enough of him and wanted him out. But by this point, Lenin was too powerful to stop. The split between his faction, the Bolsheviks, and his opponents, the Mensheviks, eventually spiraled into an all-out civil war. Lenin, along with his buddies Stalin and Trotsky, would create the Red Army to fight the opposing White Army, made up of everyone except Lenin. In the process of fighting the war, both sides may have committed some light war crimes like execution of prisoners, murder of civilians, and robbery of entire towns. The violence only got worse when the Tsar was executed by some really radical communists, and don't forget, while all of this is happening, the Germans are still burning their way through the Belarusian countryside. The power vacuum caused by the civil war let hundreds of rebel groups rise up and create their own states from the crumbling empire. Finland, Ukraine, and Latvia all declared independence, and then immediately started fighting each other to hopefully get the most territory before being steamrolled by the advancing German army. Lenin realized that he couldn't win a war on 3 fronts, and so decided to make peace with the Germans so that the Russians could focus on defeating their main enemy, other Russians. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in 1918, got the Germans off of the communists' back, but surrendered almost all of Western Russia in the process. The war in the East would come to an end as a German victory. But the last remains of the Russian army still fought on the mountains of the Caucasus, and with the Ottoman government becoming increasingly frustrated with how slow the war was going, they needed to turn to drastic measures. After the victory at the Gallipoli, the Ottomans got a second wind of energy, which they used to launch attacks on all fronts into the Balkans, Palestine, and the Armenia. Under the command of the now General Mustafa Kemal, the Ottoman army drove the British out of Palestine, while Generals Demal and Hakim were able to stabilize the fronts in other areas. However, in the Caucasus, fighting was much slower. Poor infrastructure, rough terrain, and stiff resistance from Russian remnants slowed combat to a snail's pace. The Ottomans were already on thin ice with the local population because of their lack of support, and all it would take was one incident for the entire region to collapse into genocide. During the siege of Baku, Armenian militias had organized to help defend their city against the attack, and to the Turks this was a step too far. Enver Pasha, the same one who had lost half the army at Ardahan, had risen through the ranks to control the Ottoman government. His long-standing hatred of Armenians had never been a secret, but until now he had never acted on it. Orders were given for the army to round up thousands of Armenians from their homes and march them to Syria to be put in camps. Their property was stolen by Turkish soldiers, and civilians routinely murdered with no given reason. Hundreds of churches in the region were destroyed, and monasteries burned in an attempt to erase any trace of Armenian history. Enver Pasha would create and personally command a unit known as the Army of Islam, which was responsible for the murder of over 10,000 Armenian civilians through deliberate starvation and mass executions. The time would come to be remembered as the Armenian genocide, resulting in the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians. Enver Pasha would never face justice for his crimes, and to this day the modern Republic of Turkey denies that a genocide ever happened, even with overwhelming evidence. While the Northern Front was transforming into a living hell in the Southern Front, Ataturk's Fifth Army was dealing defeat after defeat to the British. But a rebellion by the Arab tribes was supported by the Allies and was led by Sharif bin Ali of Mecca, alongside British Major T. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. Their constant hit-and-run attacks against Ottoman supplies stretched Turkish forces to their limits, having to defend hundreds of miles of desert. By 1918, the Ottomans would be pushed out of the Caucasus by the new Armenian Republic, and new reinforcements were arriving from Britain to the Middle East daily. No matter how skilled of a commander Ataturk was, even he couldn't win when outnumbered 8-1. The final major battle of the war at Megi would be a British victory. The Ottomans saw the writing on the wall and finally surrendered in October of 1918, accepting the division of the empire into 5 new nations. With the surrender of Ottomans and soon after the surrender of the Austrians, Germany was on its last legs. The entry of the United States into the war was the final straw, and now it wasn't a matter of if Germany would lose, it was when.
When Congress met together for the first time on April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked them to declare war on Germany. Wilson said that Germany was at war with the United States because it broke its promise to stop open submarine warfare in the North Atlantic and Mediterranean seas, and it also tried to get Mexico to join an alliance against the United States. The U.S. Senate voted in favor of the bill to go to war with Germany on April 4th, 1917. And 2 days later, the House agreed. After that, on December 7th, 1917, the U.S. went to war with Austria-Hungary and Germany. Germany's 1917 submarine assaults on passenger and cargo ships prompted Wilson to lead the U.S. into World War I. Let's go more into detail. After the March 1916 sinking of an unarmed French boat, the Sussex, in the English Channel, Wilson threatened to cut diplomatic ties with Germany unless the German government stopped attacking passenger ships and let enemy merchant ships' crews escape. On May 4th, 1916, the German government accepted these provisions in the Sussex Pledge. The situation in Germany shifted by January 1917, though. The German Navy convinced the military command and Kaiser Wilhelm II at a wartime conference that month that unrestricted submarine warfare could defeat Great Britain in 5 months. After providing weapons and financial aid to the Allies, the U.S. could no longer be deemed neutral, in violation of the Sussex Pledge, according to German authorities. The Allied blockade of Germany also made Germany fear the U.S. had compromised its neutrality. Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, Germany's chancellor, opposed this move, believing that resuming submarine warfare would lure the U.S. into the war for the Allies. This would defeat Germany, he said. Although warned, the German government resumed unrestricted submarine assaults on all Allied and neutral transport within war zones, believing German submarines would end the war before the first American troop ship reached in Europe. Thus, on January 13, 1917, the German ambassador to the U.S., Count Johann von Bernstorff, informed Robert Lansing of Germany's plan to resume unrestricted submarine warfare the next day. On February 14th, stunned President Wilson informed Congress that he had to cut diplomatic ties with Germany. He didn't call for a declaration of war because he didn't think the American public would back him up without any proof that Germany planned to strike U.S. ships without any warning. Wilson offered to negotiate with Germany provided its submarines stopped assaulting American ships. In February and March 1917, German submarines sank many American ships, killing many passengers and seamen. Wilson asked Congress to arm American commerce ships with U.S. naval personnel and equipment on February 26th. Refusal and pleas of no by anti-war senators lasted the rest of the congressional session, keeping the proposal from passing. After Congress rejected his request, Wilson armed American commerce ships by executive order, citing an outdated anti-piracy legislation. Things took a turn on January 19, 1917, when Germany sent out an infamous telegram to Mexico known as the Zimmermann Telegram. This telegram was persuading and manipulating Mexico to join forces with Germany in return for land that they've lost in the United States, like Texas, New Mexico, etc. This message was intercepted by the British, And the British originally kept this from the United States because they didn't want the Germans finding out that they decrypted their telegram. But due to the unrestricted submarine warfare all the way in February, the British used this kind of as a persuade, and like they used it to dangle in front of the United States, like, oh, this is gonna happen to you. But despite that, the United States was still hesitant to join. And it wasn't until the sinking of the Lusitania that finally President Woodrow Wilson felt comfortable, along with more public support, to join the war. And the Germans' consistent submarine attacks just showed Germans had no desire to stop the war. And these things influenced the United States to declare war on Germany. Barely.
With both of its allies knocked out of the war, and with growing unrest at home, the Germans knew it was just a matter of time before the end came. With the surrender of the Russians in late 1917, the German General Staff saw an opportunity to end the war without defeat. They recalled troops from the Eastern Front to harden defences in France, and with their last remaining supplies and men, they launched the 100 Days Offensive. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, recently transferred from Petersburg, along with new Field Marshal Victor von Lehmann, commanded the initial attacks to break through the Allied lines, but it was no use. After a disastrous defeat at the Marne, Ludendorff suffered a mental breakdown and had to resign, while Hindenburg's army was almost completely destroyed at Amiens. The newly arrived American Expeditionary Force was able to hold against Liman's attacks at Bella Wood, and eventually counter-attacked, routing his army. In Germany, revolutionaries were rebelling in the streets, with the High Seas Fleet dealing with a mutiny from sailors who refused to go to war. In October, Generals Hindenburg, Mackensen, and Admiral Hipper approached the Kaiser and told him to surrender. They couldn't continue the war anymore with the resources that they had, and if they went on any longer, the government would collapse. Reluctantly, the Emperor accepted, and the new Prime Minister, Maximilian von Baden, opened negotiations with the Allies later that week. The armistice would be signed at Compiègne, and on November 11, 1918, World War I would officially come to an end. But while the war was over, the much harder task of deciding what to do with the post-war world would begin. The German government acknowledged the 14 points which Wilson had proposed to the United States Congress in January 1918 as the cornerstone of a fair peace when it requested U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to orchestrate a universal ceasefire in October 1918. Nevertheless, the Allies insisted that Germany should pay for compensation for all damage done to the civilian population of the Allies and their property by the aggression of Germany by land, by sea, and from the air and sea. Secret accords negotiated by England, France, and Italy with Greece, Romania, and each other in the closing years of the war further confused the 9 issues pertaining to new territory consignments. In the spring of 1919, while the globe was still in the middle of the April 19, 1918 influenza pandemic, the treaty was drafted during the Paris Peace Conference. The Big Four national leaders, the prime ministers of the 4 countries who were present at the meeting, were Vittorio Orlando of Italy, Woodrow Wilson of the USA, Georges Clemenceau of France, and David Lloyd George of the UK. Specifically, the first 3 were responsible for making important judgments. Even the affiliated Allied powers had a small hand in drafting the pact, while the vanquished nations had no input whatsoever. They offered the fait accompli to the German representatives. The harshness of the terms startled them, and they opposed to the inconsistencies between the treaty and the promises made during the armistice negotiations. Most particularly repulsive to the Germans was accepting the reparations terms and the war guilt clause. The Treaty of Versailles reduced Germany's population and territory by approximately 10%. In the West, France regained some of their states back, Alsace and Lorraine, and the Saarland southwestern German state, was supervised by the League of Nations until 1935. The northern part of Schleswig was returned to Denmark following a plebiscite, but 3 smaller parts were ceded to Belgium. After a vote, Poland gained part of Upper Silesia, a corridor to the Baltic Sea that divided East Prussia from the rest of Germany, and the majority of what was once German West Prussia and Poznan in the east. A free city was declared in Gdańsk. The Allied powers of Japan, Britain, and France seized all of Germany's overseas territories in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Basically, German states got passed around to different countries. Pretty sad for Germany, and that wasn't it. The war guilt section of the treaty said that Germany started the war and had to pay the Allies for their losses and damages. At the time the treaty was being written, it was not possible to figure out the exact amount that had to be paid to make up for the damage the Germans did, especially in France and Belgium. However, in 1921, a committee that looked at the losses suffered by civilians came up with $33 billion. At the time, analysts said that such a large amount could never be collected without causing problems for international finances. However, the Allies demanded that Germany pay, and the treaty gave them the power to punish Germany if it fell behind on its payments. It wasn't until 2010 that Germany finished paying its debts.